here at the Greater Des Moines Partnership, and we're very pleased to bring you this webinar today regarding COVID-19 and the impact on international supply chains. I want to thank our speaker, Adam Hill from Scarborough International, for joining us today, and would also like to thank the Iowa Economic Development Authority for co-sponsoring this event. Moving ahead, just a couple of housekeeping items here before we get started. Please mute your microphone. Please turn off your video to save bandwidth. And please use the chat feature for questions. And for this webinar this afternoon, we would like to keep this interactive. So rather than waiting until the end for questions, we're asking you to please submit those during the conversation. I will be monitoring those questions as they come in, and we'll get those answered for you as Adam is going through and covering the material. Just a preview of what we're going to cover today. Obviously, international supply chains have been disrupted really ever since the beginning of COVID-19, going all the way back into late 2019. And so we're going to kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive on some of those issues today. More specifically, we're going to cover the overall ocean and air capacity issues, the effects on importers and exporters, the impact on domestic trucking, and the continuously changing federal regulations. And we're really pleased to be joined today by Adam Hill with Scarborough International. Scarborough Companies is a full-service international and domestic transportation provider, as well as a U.S. and Mexico customs broker. Adam started with Scarborough in 2006 and has held various roles in the organization and was appointed President and Chief Operating Officer in early 2019. Adam has served as an invited speaker at local, regional, and national levels on various topics, including ACE, NAFTA, USMCA, and changing rules of the customs brokers. Happy to say Adam is also serving on the Greater Des Moines Partnership's Global DSM International Council. And I believe many of you on this video have seen him today as he has presented about NAFTA in Des Moines in the past. And with that, I will turn it over to Adam. And again, please submit your questions during the presentation, and we will get those answered as we move along.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me, just general here today. I think it's a good opportunity to talk through what we are seeing in the marketplace. Obviously, I know we have a unique perspective on with the group of companies that we have. We have a really unique perspective as we get to see 4,000 or 5,000 people a year do the exact same thing. And so I always say that that's one of the most interesting things about my job and our job in general is we get to see a lot of people who import, and importing's importing or exporting's exporting. And so there are some nuances that get involved, but we've been able to see a lot, and over the past, at this point, 36 years in business, have had a good run at a lot of different things. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting going here. So with that, here's just some quick contact details. There'll be some more here at the end. So really, as I'm going to do my absolute best today to stay apolitical here and not try to go any one way too far or another. But in a lot of what our conversations are going to be today is what we see as the facts, or as close as we can get to the facts. As any of you know, with the amount of news coming out of this is astronomical. There's a lot that's coming to all of us, especially as myself as leading our group. I get peppered daily with all sorts of different newsletters and updates on what is this office or that office going to do as we look to, do we continue to work from home like I am today, and I'm sure most of you are, or do we start reintegrating the office, and what does that look like? And so there's a lot coming into this. And so, what we really want to do is take a step back, kind of walk through where some of these issues have started, what we're seeing today. And like Ryan said, please, please, please ask your questions. It makes it a lot more fun for me personally, just in general, to sit here and be able to answer your questions. I would be happy to turn all the slides off now and just sit here and chat for an hour if there was that many questions that came in. So please do ask your questions. Ryan will kind of monitor those as they come in, and then we'll ask them and we'll get going. So obviously Wuhan has been a really big piece of the start of COVID-19. And what I don't think a lot of people realize is how central Wuhan is to a lot of trade that happens in Asia. As we look at China over the years, for the longest time, everyone moved right up to the coast. So places like Shanghai exploded, when Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and so now we have Shenzhen exploding, Xiamen and all these port cities. Well, over the last decade, cargo has started to move farther inland. We've seen more things move down the Yangtze River. And so what you're going to notice is Wuhan is actually a really big manufacturing hub. It's a really big hub just in general for a lot of the inland points in China where cargo may come in ways that you and I wouldn't think is normal transportation, and then get on what we would consider normal, a truck, a train, something like that, and maybe make its final journey to Shanghai to get in a container and finally move inland. So Wuhan is important because of that. Wuhan's just now really starting to reopen. And as Ryan said, this started back in late 2019. And I don't think maybe we saw some of it coming, but from our perspective, I had trips scheduled to go abroad in January and February, and I didn't go. And so it was really interesting as we saw this kind of starting to take shape. So we have December 2019. Oh, sorry, a little typo there. We eventually have kind of the news starts to talk about this a little bit. And when I say the news, we got some reports out of the Wall Street Journal. We got a few other reports, but not a lot really coming out of this. Then we get into January, right? The Chinese New Year holiday at the end. And all of a sudden, then we start to see, okay, does the New Year happen a little sooner? And then the Chinese New Year starts to grow. And all of a sudden, now we're at factories shutting down, no transportation. And then we go, and that's that last week to week and a half in January. And then we look at February, and all of a sudden, China is shut down. So everything that has now happened since really middle of January to February, we are starting to feel the impacts. And this is something that we tried to talk to my own team about. We talked to all of our clients about that. This change of shutting down China for 6 weeks, a legitimate 6 weeks, what does that downstream impact really start to look like? Because China, at the end of the day, is the world's factory. And so, one of the conversations, and I think, and we'll touch on it later too, is China starts to become, as people, and I do think that our administration has done a good job, if that's the right word, of criminalizing China, whether or not you like them, don't like them, but they are the world's factory. So when you start to think about these ideas of decoupling your supply chains from China, make sure you understand where, if now you're buying from someone in Germany, well, where are they getting their raw material? Are they just getting it from a different factory in China? So have you really decoupled from China, if that's really where you want to go? So I say that not because I'm opposed to China, but just because I'm opposed to this idea of decoupling when we don't necessarily understand what that whole supply chain looks like. So as January and February, right, we have all the blank sailings in China. There's no cargo moving out of China for an entire month. Then all of a sudden we hit March. And March starts to get really interesting because China starts to come back online, right? You get early March, you get factories at 5%, 10%. And by the end of March, 60, 70%, right? But then you start to look at the US, you start to look at Europe. And all of a sudden, the US is starting to issue shelter in place, right? Scarborough went home St. Patrick's Day, March 17th. So just as China was finally getting back online, our companies went home, and we're still home today. And then we start, the US ports in the airports continue, but we start to see a lot of this mix of, hey, my cargo's starting to move slower. Or we start to see, now I can't get my product from Europe because they couldn't get their material from China. Or we see this scenario in March is really when a lot of this started to kick off, when it wasn't so much that there wasn't product in Europe or product in, let's say, South America, but the lack of Chinese sailings to those countries and to those just continents started to impact container availability as you started to move things in. And the minute we start to impact container availability, that's when the rates start to get a little lopsided on us, right? That's when rates start to climb. That's when the whole idea of these rates lasting for a month, continually shrinks and shrinks and shrinks down. And we really get to a spot of the market is unbelievably volatile. And we start to see at the end of March, we start to see air import rates, especially out of China, explode. And we'll talk on that here in a little bit more, but Europe's rates go up, flights, as people stop traveling, right? Less people means less planes. And for all of you who have traveled, you look out the window, whether it's a domestic flight or not, you're going to see cargo getting loaded on your plane. And that's really important to notice, that all of these passenger flights carry cargo. And as much as people think that people are kind of the mainstay of the airlines, I think what they're all starting to see is that cargo plays a really important role in all of that. And that's really important to them. So as we start to see some of this kind of mess start to happen in March, then we get into April, right? Now we're 60 plus days out. And we start to see the PPE, or the personal protective equipment, and a lot of people start to get into a scenario where they're like, maybe I want to import this for my company. Or you see a lot of opportunistic folks where you're going to get into a scenario where maybe I can import these because I have a good contact over there. And then all of a sudden, all of the regulations start to change, right? We started in April with people just trying to get access to the goods. Well, you got to remember, there's no flights coming. So then we're like, okay, what's next? Then we start to get into a scenario where now we're at chartered flights. And then we're at a scenario where they're telling us, especially mid-April, rates are moving from $5, $6 a kilo all the way up to $20+ a kilo out of China. And then we get into this 30% deposit, 40% deposit. And a lot of people and the airlines revoking credit terms for the whole for really the industry as a whole. And you start to see the impact in April of all of this PPE product starting to move. We've moved a good chunk of it ourselves. Our clients have moved a good chunk. But not only that, we have clients in the US who actually make some of this or import it from a different factory that then want to send it abroad, and they're starting to have issues supplying their own facilities abroad. And the government did come out and say, if you're exporting PPE to your own facilities abroad, that's okay. But there's still a lot of steps that need to be taken. And now we get to May, right? So the month that we're in. So we're starting to see, I live in Kansas City. So May 18th, that was a big day here. That's when Kansas City kind of started to reopen. And so we're starting to see some of these restrictions lessen. And, I was talking to our board at our last board meeting, and their question to me was always, when are we going back to work? And I said, our people have been great. They've done a phenomenal job. And at the end of the day, I'm not worried about us going back to work. I'm worried about all of you going back to work, right? And the economy kind of picking up, because our company and our people have done a great job. But as we started to see, manufacturing output is just down a little bit, right? as these Chinese factories are starting to get busier and busier, now we're starting to run into issues where we have oversupply in, or I should say over demand in China, and we have containers starting to back up there. And we'll get into that here in a minute. And then as China is really here in May getting back to as close to normal as they've been since late December, then we see India drop, right? 30% capacity. Brazil's getting hit really hard right now. And so we're seeing this virus move around the globe, and the impacts of this are going to be far reaching. In January of this year, I told our team I thought it would be August before this kind of made its way all the way back around. And I think that kind of might be where we are by the time the virus first kind of makes its way around the world. And then you have all of these supply chain things that kind of follow suit, right? It started in China, so they shut down. Then it gets here. So as we start to shut down, China starts to open up, but then we don't need to buy as much right now. And so you start to see this massive domino effect of globalization really take place across our supply chains. And I think that for the first time, people are really understanding how complex some of what they believe are relatively simple supply chains really are. When you start to say, well, I just buy my product from a guy in Germany, and then realize that he has to source 3 products from India, a product from China, and a product from the UK that he then imports into Germany, makes the widget that he turns around and sells to you. And so you start to see that come to shape. And I don't think people always realized, who is your supplier's supplier. And I think one of the big things that's coming out of this is we're seeing a really big push from our own client base, especially on the import side of, hey, supplier, who are your suppliers? Where are you getting your raw materials from? They understand that they might not get names, phone numbers, and addresses, so you could go direct, and that's not the point, but they're trying to understand what does their risk profile look like as this trend continues to take us farther and farther away from just buying from the guy down the street or just buying from someone in Germany, because you start to realize that there's a lot of information, there's a lot of goods flow prior to you getting whatever parts you get to. So now we're 3 or 4 days away from June, right? May's almost behind us now. And as far as like the personal protective equipment, we're starting to see a significant drop, which has also coincided with significant drops in air freight rates, because we're starting to see passenger travel. If you look at just the stats from the last week, is up just a little bit, right? So we're starting to see just a little bit more movement. I don't know if it's everyone's getting just more comfortable in general or what that trend is, but to me, June is going to be very, very telling about how this is going to play out for the rest of 2020. If things start to pick up, everyone hopefully stays relatively healthy. I think we're in a decent spot to kind of ride out the rest of this year. If things start to open up in June and all of a sudden we have a resurgence, and do people go back home? Do they not? What does that look like to the economy? I think June is kind of, in my opinion, the bellwether for the rest of 2020. How June flows is how the rest of the year flows. Obviously, something could happen in late fall, but just based on our gut and kind of what we're seeing, June is going to tell us a lot. So now that we've kind of gone through the timeline, I want to talk a little bit about just capacity and rates in really 5 main areas that Ryan talked about. So the first one is the ocean freight side. And as we kind of walk through that timeline, if you think back, right, we had all of this space not shipping for a long time. So carriers started blanking sailing. So they weren't moving containers, they weren't moving vessels, nothing was moving around the globe. So now what's happened is now we have Chinese factory producing at 80 to 90% of what they were producing, but you have vessel capacity at maybe 50 or 60%, if that, of where it was. So you look at the amount of supply of containers compared to the amount of demand on the shipper side, and we have a big imbalance, right? Especially in China, we're starting to see cargo get rolled. We're starting to see, you're making a booking, but at the end of the day, you might not make this week's sailing, you might make next week's sailing or the week after. We've had some people approach us and say, can we pay more above and beyond what our current rate structure is to get space on a vessel because the cargo is that urgent? And, we've seen it as high as $800 for a container to gain new space. And because what happens in these scenarios, as these rates start to skyrocket, the carriers, being the steamship lines, take a look at this and they say, if I have one container paying me $3,000 and one container paying me $4,000, and I only have room for one, I'm picking the one that's paying me four. And so that's what we're really starting to see in the Chinese export market over there, which is very similar to what we see during what we would call traditional peak season, right? These later summer months, as really you get the US retail Christmas rush in. And you get back to school and then you get Christmas. And all of that really coincides with what the carriers call peak season. And you start to see some of that there, and you're seeing it now in China. I mean, we've seen carriers announce up to $1,000 GRIs, or general rate increases, from 1 2-week span to the next. So you're seeing a lot of market volatility right now. You're going to see rates jump all over the board. Those of you that signed fixed contracts, be kind of wary of what that's going to look like coming into June. Are you getting space? What does that look like? Do you have anything in your contracts that can help hold those carriers accountable for the amount of space that you have? So there's a lot that's really starting to go into the ocean freight, especially from China, right? And then to tie into that, you have, as China shut down, you had people looking to Southeast Asia. You had people looking to Korea. You had people looking to these other Asian countries to say, well, maybe I can source from there. And especially if you get into Southeast Asia, the Vietnams of the world, their infrastructure just isn't the same as China's, right? China is 20 years ahead of them as far as infrastructure with rail and road capacity. So we really get into a scenario that they're having a hard time keeping up, simply from the fact that they don't have the same infrastructure level that China does as far as just moving freight in general. So on kind of the flip side, we can talk about the ocean freight on the export side, right? So we have seen some minor issues here. In certain markets, we've seen severe equipment shortages, and in other markets, they haven't been that bad. And really what that's from is the amount of influx of cargo that did or did not come in from the Far East. And really that's what a lot of that's about. So if you're on a carrier that's a predominantly Far East carrier, and that's who you are moving cargo back out on, you saw a lot more equipment issues than if you saw carriers maybe coming out of South America, or carriers that are more predominantly European carriers, because they had a slowdown, but they didn't have the abrupt just stop that we saw out of China for 6 weeks. So we are starting to see some of the equipment issues starting to kind of wane as there's more and more cargo coming in. And really tied into this, and a question that we've gotten a lot recently, is, do we think there's going to be a backup at the US ports because of all of this extra cargo? And the answer is no, because the vessels are only so big. And so at this point, we're taking them and processing them at pretty much normal rates here in the US. So just as containers are coming in, they're getting processed and going back out. Now, we ran into an issue in Houston. It's probably been 2 months now, where one of the dock workers tested positive. They shut the port down for a day or two. And so we still might see that here and there, but ultimately we don't anticipate a big backup at any US port, simply because there's just not as much volume rolling through there. And even if volume starts to pick back up, the ports are already designed for the amount of cargo that they're starting to get in. Now, if all of a sudden we see that carriers, instead of blanking sailings, start to add extra sailings out of China. So instead of 10,000, they're moving 20,000 a week. Then, yeah, there could be an issue for a backup, because we're getting more than what we're used to. But in general, we really don't foresee the carriers adding a lot of new capacity to the market, which means we don't really see issues coming on the US side as far as port capacity goes and seeing any big delays or backlogs in the US ports. So let's move on to kind of the air freight side of life. So we talked about this a little bit, and I think this is something that is just not being talked about enough with air cargo in general, is the lack of passenger flights equals lack of cargo capacity, right? There's only so many all cargo flights. There's only so many freighters, and a lot of times those freighters are reserved for cargo that's hazmat or cargo that we've deemed as a country that says, you know what, we don't want this cargo flying underneath the belly of a 300-person airplane, right? That mix doesn't happen. So there's cargo that flies. It has to fly what's called cargo only. And the airlines for the longest time, passenger cargo has been their bread and butter, right? People. So the more people they move, the more money they make, the more flights they put on. And then the cargo was kind of a bonus to them, right? It was that value add at the end that they could bring on and really boost their revenue without boosting really any additional cost, because they're already paying for that. You and I pay for that and sitting on an airplane seat. Well, as these carriers are pulling out, flying at 30 and 40% of normal flights, now all of a sudden you've sucked all of that cargo capacity out of the market. And so you're starting to see a lot of things that are actually kind of interesting. And the FAA actually just said that it's okay to put cargo in the passenger cabin. So you'll see, if any of you've probably seen a lot of pictures where there's boxes cargo netted into seats on airplanes. And what's interesting is the US is actually very slow to allow this. European countries, Asian countries allowed this almost immediately, and we've been very slow to pick this up. But as the ocean side, right, as countries shut down and we get less product, those of you who run manufacturing lines have this severe need for product now, product faster. So then our air cargo, not only do we need more product via air, but now we have less capacity in the market, which is prime for the carriers to do what they've done. And that is raise the rates exponentially. So we talked about China, right? We're at $4.55 a kilo. We're at $20 a kilo. Now, a lot of that came from specifically personal protective equipment, but at the end of the day, you're seeing rates 4 and 5 times greater than what they usually are. And, then you get into Europe and, you just need more time. You need that additional amount of time to make sure that your cargo is going to get on a plane. The rates have spiked there, but nowhere near where they have in China. And to kind of give you an example back on China, just this week, rates have dropped down to, we've seen $8, $9, and $10 a kilo now. So we've gone from this $4.55 to 20. Now we've cut it in half again back to 10. And so there's a lot of movement right now in the air freight market on the import side. And it's something that I think we're going to see for a long time. I think rates are going to be higher for a while just because of all the people not traveling. And so airlines are starting to get a little smarter. And we've started to see them put, blank passenger flight, but they're still flying because they can still move cargo and they're getting paid against that cargo. So they're starting to kind of catch on to maybe cargo should be something that's more of a core business rather than people. And so I'm kind of curious to see what the rest of this year really holds for the airlines. We've seen bailouts go everywhere here in the US, Europe, Australia, all over the board. We're starting to see bailouts of airlines. And so the question is, do they take it? Do they do right by the government that bailed them out? And do they keep this thing moving? Or are we just a stopgap into an ultimate failure of some airline somewhere that's then going to have a ripple effect across the cargo market in general? But I do see that rates are going to be elevated probably for the rest of this year. they're not going to, I don't think we're going to see $20 a kilo out of China again this year, but we are definitely going to see elevated rates. And I don't know if we're going to get those rock bottom air freight rates that we've seen in the past really out of China or the EU for the remainder of 2020 and probably into early 21. If you're looking for air freight rates out of China to return to normal, you're probably looking beyond and sometime in February of 21 after Chinese New Year's over and again for 21. And then I think assuming that everyone's healthy and the virus is, I don't know what the right word for it is, then we'll start to see where the market starts to stabilize itself again. Air freight starts to return to more of a normal level. You probably see more people flying, and all of a sudden there's just more capacity on the market. And if cargo is moving at a normal clip, that more capacity then will still have its spikes here and there, but we won't see what we've seen in a matter of weeks really here for the import air freight market. Oh, sorry about that. As we move on to the export market, we're in the same boat, right? The import and the export really doesn't change. Capacity is decreasing 75%. I mean, air freight to Brazil right now is nearly impossible with how bad Brazil's getting hit. You look at air freight to India right now, more or less the same. You can't no one's flying there right now. So there's no air freight there. Rates are doubling. Obviously, air export and air import are obviously very, very, very similar. The less people equals less cargo capacity. And if that's really the only thing you get from today in our conversation is that if you want to see your cargo rates drop, watch the number of people flying. If the number of people flying stays low, cargo rates are going to stay high. It's just kind of that supply and demand piece of that. And with that capacity being as low as it is right now, we're going to still be on this same boat. So let's talk domestic for a minute. So domestic market is a little bit different. So truck capacity right now, we've seen actually isn't terrible. It's not perfect, but it's not terrible. Refrigerated shipments, there's almost always capacity crunch there. So this doesn't really seem that big, especially now. This is produce season. But the big thing that we're seeing on the domestic side is pricing pressure. And you're seeing the volumes start to pick up a little bit as we get this return to work, right? And people say, okay, now I've made my stuff and maybe I was a little bit slower and now I need to get something there. The spot market rates right now are still relatively low, which is it's good for you and it's bad for the rest of everybody else, because spot market rates being as low as they are right now hurts the truckers, which then in turn starts to get us into scenarios where, we see truckers who can't make payments and we see truckers who go bankrupt because the rates can't support them. But what we're seeing right now is tender rejections are actually very low. And what that means is the carriers are taking any piece of freight they can because there's capacity in the market. And so whenever there's capacity, the carriers would rather move for $1 a mile than not move at all. And so as that capacity starts to shrink and maybe we see some more volume pick up, you're going to see the rate start to move up a little bit. They've kind of inched up here recently, and I say inched is probably is the most aggressive word I'll use for how much they've gone up, but inched up recently. But we're still going to be in the scenario where I think for at least the next month or so, we're going to run into some more issues with truck capacity. I don't think the domino effect of truckers going bankrupt is over. We saw a big one last year kind of before all this with the Celadon collapse and kind of how that flowed into Mexico. And I think we're starting to see more and more of it, and we're going to see more and more of it. For those of you who follow, YRC missed some massive payments here in the last couple of weeks to its pension plan and to some debt obligations. And so I think you're really going to start to see these impacts of what this first 5-6 calendar months of this year has really impacted my sector or just the logistics sector in general, where we've seen companies who have maybe been a little bit over leveraged are having a tough go of kind of where they ended up. So on top of all of this, our government has tried to do things, some good, some not good, right? Depending on which side you are, of kind of these temporary regulations. While in theory it's great, they do obviously pose a lot of extra stress and heartache on our client base. So, the FDA has relaxed imports on PPE, which then caused a lot of people to try to bring them in, which then caused rate spikes in China. And so you start to see how everything's really interconnected. One of the things our government did do was very early on, they started to add some additional Section 301 exclusions, especially on medical, and I'll just say medical, even beyond PPE. And so what they were doing is some of those 301 duties, right? Those anywhere from 7.5% to 25% from China that we've all been dealing with for the past couple of years now, they started to relax it and say, you know what, right now we're not going to enforce. We saw the duty exemption, and I will just call it debacle. That was this idea of, okay, we're allowing a 90-day extension. We said we were going to do it. When people started to report on it, then we said, no, there's no way. And then they said, yeah, we're going to do it. And then all of a sudden, overnight, they gave the entire industry 24 hours to pull everything together. And so I really think that piece of it was really difficult to work through for all of our customers, trying to figure out, can we, at this point, not exempt, but at least delay our duty payments for at least 90 days? And when can you and when can't you, and all the ifs, ands, and buts. And customs, with all of sometimes their own faults, did a phenomenal job at allowing the trade to do this, because this came down at more or less 11 p.m. Eastern on a Sunday night. And we had, as a trade community, until 11:59 Eastern on Monday of that week. So you're looking at less than 20, just at 24 hours to make all the changes necessary to get our customers those duty deferrals from the previous month. So it was a long day. I think my wife saw my forehead growing and my hair turning gray all at the same time while I was at home trying to work through all of our clients that day, but we luckily made it through. And then all of a sudden you get all this new PPE product starting to come in, and now the Chinese government is saying, wait a minute, we need to inspect all of this. So now you're seeing inspections sometimes take 5-10 days to even get cargo out, and not everything is being allowed to get out. And we talk about those 30 and 40% deposits that people had to pay, and you pay a 30%, Chinese customs doesn't clear your goods. You know what? It doesn't matter. You still owe that 30%. And so that was a tough pill to swallow for a few folks. So it was really, really interesting to kind of watch this PPE thing kind of turn and move. So
we've got a couple questions that have come in here.
Fire away.
First is from Peggy Kerr, and it goes back to air freight, and she wants to know, is air freight to Italy currently impacted for U.S. exports?
It is, simply because, kind of going back to that original conversation of, there's just so many less passenger flights right now. And, there for a while, especially early on, you had the largest airport in Italy, Milan, and the area surrounding Milan shut down practically. And so you saw a 90+% drop in passenger travel. Well, that's a 90% plus drop in cargo capacity. And so it's starting to come back now. Italy's starting to kind of get back under their feet. We do a lot of business there. I have friends there. That's kind of an interesting thing about this, is as I have done more and more at Scarborough and taken on more, is that, I've developed friendships at this point all over the world. And so it's been interesting to talk to your friends at this point about, what is it really like there? Don't tell me, president to president about what you want me to hear about your business and how you guys are doing just fine. As a friend, how are things going? And so you could definitely see some change there sometimes in how people would really let you know about what was going on.
Very good. And then we've got a couple here related to PPE on the
Mhm.
import side. And the first is, what sort of activity have you seen from the influx of PPE imports?
So, we've seen, I'll give you a great example. We're working with a retailer right now and a supplier that they're bringing in. I think probably a few million masks here in the last really 2 weeks. And so I think what you're starting to see is you saw a big influx of PPE early for people trying to just get stuff in, whether it's for themselves, whether it's for their own companies. And now, as this return to, we'll put it in quotes, kind of normal, right? As people, these stay at home orders start to loosen a little bit, you're seeing the retail market say, wait a minute, even if I don't usually sell this, can I import it and can I make money on it? And so we've seen a big uptick, it seems like, in people you wouldn't necessarily expect to be carrying PPE, asking to get them imported, whether it's through us, through their standard channels, however it may be. We're just seeing a big influx there. And I think you're seeing a lot of people that are trying to be very opportunistic in this market and look for opportunities to say, can I import them for $1 and sell them for $2? And so, and those have probably been the toughest ones to deal with, simply because these people don't usually import, they don't understand the processes. And then you get all the additional regulations on top of the PPE. But those folks who are standard importers, who import often, even if they don't import PPE items often, haven't had too much difficulty getting things through. They've been through relatively reputable channels. But we have seen kind of some of those opportunistic people trying to bring some stuff in, which good for them. And I understand definitely what they're trying to do, that have had a little bit more issue and probably caused a little bit more gray hair for all of us.
Very good. And then another PPE related question. What suggestions do you have for importers that may not have sourcing or fulfillment in place, but want to purchase PPE for industrial use? And then really the same question for medical use.
Good question. I think overall, really what you're looking at for PPE is, if you reach out to your partners around the world, your factories, especially if you're buying currently from Asia in general, reach out, ask them if they have contacts. There's a lot of people importing this stuff right now. You're going to start to see it more on the US market. And so I would really try to go through my standard channels right now. Because there's so much bad still coming out of China, which is where we're seeing all of the Chinese customs exams and things like that, which are really good for them to do to make sure we're not getting bad product into the market. But my recommendation is stay your normal course, because when you try to go outside is when, yeah, you may win, but then we may get into some of those scenarios where you're getting something, you think it's good and it's really not. And so for us, it's all about staying your normal course. And I know that's tough right now, but to me, that's the safest way to go.
Very good. And we've got another question that just came in regarding regulations. Since there are more regulations in place, are you seeing countries and companies export less than normal?
Because of regulation, no. But yes is the answer to your question, as are they exporting less or more than, and they are exporting less. But we really haven't seen the regulations impact it too much. And if we do, they're usually small blips and very industry specific. So like, we move a lot of pet food. The pet food market has exploded and they really haven't hit a lot of things. But then we have customers who maybe import chemicals or export chemicals, and because of where they're headed, that market might be slower right now. And so I think really that's more of a market to market segment that really doesn't have a lot to do with regulation, but has a lot to do with just how the virus is affecting the global economy, more so than specific just to regulation.
Very good. Thank you.
Right. So kind of as we keep going here, and please guys keep throwing your questions out there, is kind of maybe what's ahead. So new sourcing origins. We talked about this a little bit earlier, and it's this idea of, we understand people are looking to decouple from China. And I only caution about that is really understand, where does your supplier get their supply from, right? China's done a wonderful job of becoming the world's factory. And where does that leave your next supplier? If that's where they're buying from, you haven't really decoupled. It might sound good on its face, but if you get into it a little bit, you really haven't seen it. Obviously, you have USMCA going into force July 1st. I'll give ourselves our own little plug. We have a webinar coming up specifically on USMCA here in, I think, a week or two, because there is a lot of changes coming down there. So make sure that you at least have your head somewhat wrapped around that. You know, the US has started to look at other trade deals. We've started to have conversations specifically with the UK because of Brexit and how that's going. You know, we're starting to see the product exclusions. So then you have to start to look at, what does your pricing look like? You know, you imported product 30 days ago that had 25%. It gets an exclusion today. How does your pricing work to your client? And vice versa. If you're buying product that you know has an exclusion, now at this point, do you start to say, hey, you guys aren't paying that additional 25% anymore. I need a price break, especially if you took a price increase when those tariffs started. So there's a lot right now going on that unit price negotiations that seem to be, you know, those companies that accepted price increases or were able to pass them on are now going back to the opposite and saying, hey, I passed them on to you. Now their customer who accepted them is pushing back and saying, hey, you're no longer paying, I need a discount now. And so we're seeing a lot of that start to fluctuate. I think the other thing we're starting to see is, as companies look to try to move around this, is we are seeing new markets open up, right? We're seeing suppliers start to move, whether it's in Southeast Asia, whether we have foreign investment going into Mexico, which is just booming right now from that perspective, a lot of foreign investment coming into Mexico, whether it's US investment, European investment, Chinese investment, even South American investment coming into Mexico, because a lot of them see the US as a big market. And there's a lot of US folks really looking to buy closer to home. And we could have a whole long conversation about Mexico and Canada just in general, but I think we're seeing a lot of stuff coming into Mexico right now. So, you know, be looking for maybe some new markets to buy things from, not necessarily because you've decoupled from China, but because maybe it makes more sense in the long run. You know, if you have a factory in Mexico that you're buying from, prior to all of this mess, you know, you could still get to Mexico City today. Like, I could go catch a flight right now and get myself to Mexico City yet today. It's going to be, what is it, Wednesday? It's going to be Friday before I end up in Shanghai. And so, you know, there's something to be said about that travel time. There's something to be said about, you know, pricing on full truckloads similar to pricing on full containers. So you start to look at that, and then you say, you know, it's 7 days from Mexico City and it's 30 plus days from Shanghai. I sort of say 7 days in transit versus even 28, you know, it's 25% less inventory dollars in transit. So you start to look at some of these near sourcing countries, and I think you're going to start to see some new markets open up. One of the things that we've seen that has just exploded is this distribution, e-commerce, warehousing, fulfillment, right? Our warehouses have exploded here in the last really month as people have looked to either store product because they can't accept it, or they've tried to figure out, how do we continue to sell? How do we stay viable? And I think you're seeing people, I'll give you a great example. I have there's a local bakery here that my wife and I used to buy stuff from. And when they shut down, they converted to delivering things, right? So you place an order and they deliver them to you, which is wonderful. But I think you're starting to see companies in general start to look at, hey, do we need the storefront, or do we need this? How do we continue to sell, and how do we continue to market ourselves? And then you get into this whole work from home idea that says, hey, maybe we don't need all of our people stuck together, but we still need a centralized place for my cargo, right? I need a centralized place to store my goods so I can turn around and sell them. So I think we're going to see a lot of that coming up over the next really rest of 2020 into 21 as people start to look at, what makes the most sense as this whole work from home idea. Does it continue to grow? I mean, we've seen some of the big tech companies already start, right? Twitter announced work from home indefinitely. Facebook announced that over half the workforce will be work from home within the next decade. And so I think you're going to see more and more of this, but there's certain things you can't do remotely. And one of those is physically move freight. And so as much as even my team has all been home, the folks in our warehouse and our truck drivers, they've been in every day, right? Because to physically move that freight, someone still has to be there. We kind of joke is no matter how highly complex and technical our industry gets, someone's butt has to be on a forklift in order to move that product at some point in its journey. And you can't digitize that. And so there's a lot of that I think we're still going to see from time to time, especially over the next probably 18 months, as people refigure out what their distribution models look like and see what makes the most sense for them. Well, I think with that, Ryan, I'll flip to the last slide here and then open it up to see if any more questions have come in here for the last few minutes.
Sure. Those are great points, Adam, that you made wrapping things up there. Certainly as an economic development organization, we're really paying close attention to how the landscape is going to change with people working from home for a number of weeks now, and you're seeing productivity not drop off for a lot of organizations. So we'll be watching that very, very closely. Do you expect to see more reshoring back to the United States as a result of kind of what's going on with global supply chains? You mentioned it'd be difficult to decouple from China, but do you see those trends possibly happening?
I think in some industries, yes, but I think that maybe the idea gets a little overused because everyone's like, oh, I'll just move it back here. Well, do we even make that product? Right? Do we have, or if we make it, do we make it at a price point that makes sense for your business? China may be making it on a few dollars a day and someone here is making $20 an hour. You start to say, how do they make that same product? And so you start to look at some of this stuff, and there are certain things that I don't know if you can bring them back, and B, do we want to? And I think that's the question that maybe no one's quite ready to ask yet, but do we want those jobs that are at the very bottom end of kind of that pay scale back? Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but I think that's a different conversation. And so I think this idea of, we just need to bring it all back here. I mean, granted, we make our money usually moving freight, but we have warehouses and we have trucks. So for me, yeah, it might be a different focus, but I just honestly don't see, are things going to move back here? Sure. Are things going to move out of China? Sure. But when that happens, someone else is going to say, hey, China is now making this product better than we are. And so now we're going to source from there, right? So you might see these shifts, but I don't see, and I think maybe if anything, we're going to get more this whole nearshoring idea, right? Like instead of buying, I still need to buy from somewhere else because it's still a lower cost, but can I buy it from Latin America or Mexico instead of China? Can I get my textiles out of the Caribbean instead of Southeast Asia? And you start to look at some of those things. And I think maybe that's what we might see more. Not necessarily, let's just bring it all back here, because I don't know if ultimately we can have it. And then the question is, do we want some of that work here at all?
Very good. Those are great points. We're down about 4 or 5 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, please submit those right away. Adam, I do have one more for you here. You mentioned USMCA earlier, and with that date looming large here, just want to know, what is the biggest change or most common question that you get about USMCA?
Two of them. So and I'll just say it's the most common questions that we get. The first one is, we had a form, now we don't have a form, what do we do? So there's this whole idea that the whole NAFTA form went away. And in theory, the answer is yes, the NAFTA form went away. At the end of the day, it's now just called a certificate, And you can put it in any form you desire, but the data elements are all the same. So the idea of the form went away as like, here's an official customs form for NAFTA, but the data on that form hasn't gone away at all. In fact, there's been a few other changes that have been added to it. So to me, that's a big one, because everyone's like, well, what's the new form look like? Well, it can look like whatever you want it to look like, as long as it has the right pieces of information on it. The one thing I will tell you is that we get a question is, if I had a NAFTA form in June, will it work on July 1? And the answer to that question is no. So Customs came out about a week ago and said, look, we're not going to accept that form. So I hope I didn't send everyone into a panic. Well, maybe I do hope I sent everyone into a panic, so we kind of get on this list a little bit faster. And then the other big question that we always get is, all of my product qualifies for NAFTA, so all of my product qualifies for USMCA. And the answer to that is flat out no. So NAFTA does not equal USMCA. And I think those are probably the two big ones that we get all the time. What do we do next? And obviously, like I said, we have a webinar coming up. I spoke on one about a week or so ago. There's a lot getting ready to come out on the USMCA. Everyone's kind of scrambling a little bit, to be honest, because it came out late. Entry into force seems to be very quick. Customs just put out their guidelines probably 3 weeks ago, and those aren't official, but they're really close. So there's a lot of work we can start doing. But those of you in the automotive sector, those of you in any other sector, especially textile and automotive, those are the two biggest ones hit by a long shot. And the automotive gets really crazy with this new idea of, what are our high value parts? What is our high value labor? Our high value factories? Like there's a lot that's really coming into this. And Peggy did just remind me too, is we're speaking, the Iowa Economic Development Authority is putting on a USMCA event that we will be participating in on June 24th from 9 to 10 in the morning. So if you can't make the Scarborough one, actually, I would just highly recommend you make both, because the chances on things changing in the next few weeks are very high. So I think as we start to get farther and farther into the weeds of how do we actually implement this July 1, you're going to start to see nuances come out and changes come out that you need to be prepared for. And you may not be, even if what you thought 2 weeks ago might be a little different come July 1st.
Very good. Well, we are nearing the end of our time today. Adam, I want to thank you and your team at Scarborough so much for putting this presentation together for our region today. This is something that all of us have been talking about really kind of since this whole thing started. So appreciate the great insights. Also want to mention, so in addition to the event that Peggy mentioned, which that should be a fantastic event, the USMCA event on June 24th. Just reminders on some other upcoming international events that we have. The IEDA Trade Talk Series will continue next week on June 3rd at 9 o'clock. We'll be featuring Southeast Asia. Then the following week on June 10th at 9 a.m., the representative from Mexico will give an update. And then on June 17th from 9 to 10 a.m., we'll have the Smart Online Global Marketing webinar. And again, June 24th, 9 to 10 a.m., the Preparing for USMCA, which will feature Adam Hill. That is certainly one that you do not want to miss. So thanks again, everybody, for attending today. Thanks again, Adam, for a great presentation, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day.
Perfect. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.